Hello, assalamu alaikum, namaste and sat sri akal. My name is Farheen Khan and you're watching the AZEEZA show. Last week we had some interesting conversations about domestic violence and we heard about some of the facts and the figures, statistics about how prevalent it is in our communities. And so today we have some guests with us who are going to speak to us about what it means to actually access service and how women that are affected by violence, whether it be domestic or sexual, can access service and why it's so important to do so. So with us today is Manal Faruqi and Zina Chaudhry. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us. Mm-hmm.
So I guess the conversation, as I mentioned in our last episode, was really about, there was 2 episodes that we've had so far that really have talked about violence in general. One was more focused on sexual violence, and then the other one was more focused on domestic violence. I guess in both cases, what we're trying to talk about here is violence against women, right? So can you maybe, give us an idea of like why you think that violence against women actually occurs? Why don't we start with that? It's a big question.
Manal, do you want to start
for sure. So
Okay.
I think when we're talking about violence against women and what the causes are in particular, that's a multifaceted conversation because these are larger constructs such as, colonialism, which is, targeted much of the global south. You have things like patriarchy, which is prevalent in most societies. We have things like toxic masculinity, which is masculinity that is toxic towards the men themselves and the women around them. So there's so many larger concepts that really tie into what causes sexual violence, and in particular systems that are in place within society as well that allow those things to happen.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I would say when you just said the question, the first thing that went through my mind is it's so difficult to kind of narrow down and say what causes sexual violence or what causes domestic violence because like as Manal said, there are a number of reasons why it could happen and why it does happen, and sometimes it's really inexplicable. Like we can't explain why someone has gone and done something. It could be something they've learned in culture. It could be something that they've been seeing themselves at home, and the cycle of abuse where you grow up in that kind of home and then you kind of perpetrate it yourself afterwards. It could be colonialism, it could be patriarchy, it could be a combination of everything. So it's very difficult, I think, to pinpoint a cause or anything like that. But I also believe that, spending our time, spending our energy, spending our resources on figuring this out, it might be better used towards helping the people who are victims of this or survivors of this kind of violence, because you can never pinpoint why someone does what they do, but you can always figure out and determine how to help somebody.
So can you maybe give us some examples of like from your work or, some of the experiences that you've seen over time, like what kind of, I think it's hard sometimes for us to pinpoint why, it may happen, but ultimately it's about power over another person, right? It's about trying to dominate another person. So can you give some examples maybe of like what some of the cases that you've perhaps seen or heard about? Just to give us our audience a sense, right? Because sometimes, one of the biggest things, like I know from my work in the violence against women sector, has been that oftentimes we don't even know that it's happening to us, right? And so perhaps we can share some ideas around what you think might actually be, what actually abuse could look like, yeah.
Absolutely, and I think like one of the things is that people don't realize that violence and sexual assault happens on a spectrum. That it's not necessarily just one thing that equates sexual violence. And I think like if we're talking about something that's very topical right now, it is the news about Aziz Ansari. So many people are responding that don't work in the sector or don't have an understanding about violence being a spectrum, especially sexual assault being a spectrum, don't understand that what happened in that situation was sexual assault. But when you're working in the sector and you're equipped with that sort of language, you understand that that is something that is sexual assault. So I think widening the spectrum of what we see as sexual assault and violence is really important, but also recognizing that the language that people use in the sector is language that is not as accessible to everyone. So really having education be a very pivotal thing when it comes to schools, when it comes to universities, and going forward in community programming is incredibly important. So like if there was a case I could think of, I would think of that one just because right now it's a topic of conversation.
Right. Okay, cool.
I think I would I mean, as you know, Farheen, I run Sakina Homes, which is a group of transitional homes for Muslim women and children in North America. So in my line of work, I kind of work with clients on a day-to-day basis who have gone through anywhere from financial, emotional, psychological, mental, physical, sexual abuse, any like along that spectrum, like any one of those, and a number of those sometimes combined. So for me, on a day-to-day basis, I see this kind of forefront right in front of me, like a case that, if you say what's like the last case that you worked on that had like financial abuse tied into it, I could give you like probably the last 6 cases that I worked on have all had financial abuse tied into them. How many of them have been sexual abuse? Okay, maybe 2 of those have been sexual abuse. How many of those have been like psychological abuse? Probably all of them have been psychological abuse at some point on the spectrum. So when we look at cases like this in our community, and when we look at them, like the one that you said about Aziz Ansari, it's sometimes difficult for people who don't work in the sector to pinpoint that, okay, is this abuse? Or if it is abuse, what kind of abuse is it? Sometimes people don't understand what abuse actually entails. They think it's very clear cut that, like, let's say like slapping someone across the face or sexually assaulting someone, that's abuse. But they don't understand gaslighting. They don't understand those kind of things that, you know, kind of are swept under the rug because they're not so out there in the media. They're not very prevalently, they're not talked about as often. So we sometimes miss those things, but they're very important when we're looking at helping our community and people who are going through this, because this type of abuse, or these types that you can find on the spectrum, are kind of the ones that happen most commonly.
Absolutely, and kind of like just touching upon like what you just said about monetary abuse, for example. When we say that, for example, it actually means that, you know, there's a woman, for example, who is not able to be in charge of her own money. It actually affects her agency. It affects her agency to exit the home. And, you know, that is an example of, you know, what monetary abuse would be. Legal abuse would be someone holding on to a woman or person's papers, not allowing them to, you know, be valid in this country and whatnot, right? So that when you're talking about the spectrum of abuse, there's so many different ways that someone can be impacted in one particular case of sexual violence or assault that it's multifaceted, and looking at all the different sorts of abuse that happen in a situation is one of the most important things going forward.
Yeah, no, of course. Thank you for sharing that, because I think it's often really hard for us to kind of, especially when we're in it, you know, it's very difficult to sort of figure out whether or not we're actually experiencing it. So one of the questions I think is also really key here is to talk about what happens when, you know, a woman decides to disclose that she's experiencing abuse, right? What generally happens, what have we seen in community, and what should actually be happening? Maybe we can talk about that.
Sure. You want me to? Okay. So, I mean, again, in my line of work, this is something that I see every day, because we work with the families as well sometimes, of the people who come to us if they choose to bring them into their healing process. And the majority of time, unfortunately, it's a lot of, we don't believe you because he said, she said, he's older than you. Or let's say, for example, we had a client come in and her uncle abused her for many, many years, and she told her family, and her father said, we don't believe you, like, you're just lying just to get attention. That's the way you've always been, and, you know, it doesn't matter to us. Like, he's my brother, he will continue coming to this home, he'll continue to be invited into our family, and, you know, you just have to get over whatever you think happened, because it didn't actually happen. And it led to many, many more years of abuse after her telling her family, because the uncle kind of got, you know, a little bit more like power behind him. And he was like, great, like, they believe me, they don't believe her. We can continue on doing whatever I was doing, and, like, you know, no one's the wiser. So many times that is something that happens, that they're not believed. Or, you know what, the other side can also be that many times they're believed, but nothing comes through it, because everyone's worried about pride, whether it's family pride, whether it's, you know, don't like put Muslims in the media like that, don't you know, put like Pakistanis in the media like that, don't put Indians in the media like that. Like, we don't want to, you know, make our family business like something out for everyone in the open. So let's keep it between us, we'll try and solve it. And that almost never works, because, you know, unfortunately, people in the community aren't equipped to help survivors. There are professionals out there who can help. So there's counseling services, there's shelters, there's transitional homes, there's workers, you know, therapists, counselors, people who can help you. And it's not necessary that your story is being, you know, put out there for everyone to hear and know. It's people who are close to you, people you trust, and people who work in confidentiality with you and your family who can, actually help you. And that's, I think, something that our community is missing. That kind of, they have a gap in understanding of where they can go for help, and they think once it's out, you go to the police and the police puts it out and that's it. Your family's done with. No one's gonna marry you. No one's gonna marry your sisters. Who's gonna want to be part of this family after they hear all this happen? So it kind of is a lose-lose situation, I think, for these survivors of violence, especially when it's done. Especially when it's domestic violence or violence in the family, it's very, very difficult because they're trapped, and their only way of leaving is leaving everything they know and they love behind. Because just because one family member, whether it even be a parent or a sibling, has abused you, doesn't mean that your love for the rest of your family has diminished, right? Even if I've had someone who's come to me and they said that, my family doesn't believe me, but I still love my parents. I can't live without them, and it's very difficult because she still wants to be part of her family, and I don't believe her, and it's kind of a lose-lose situation. They're kind of stuck between two hard places.
Yeah, and I think one of the factors as well within those situations is, especially if you're coming from an immigrant background, if you're from a racialized community, a religious minority community, etc. Your community units and familial units mean a lot more because that's often where you go for a lot of support, and that's where you go for so much. So when those communities kind of turn their back on you or silence you or ignore you, your options are quite limited. And in particular, kind of just like building up on what you were saying, even times when survivors do go to police services and whatnot, they are unfortunately at times not equipped to deal with those issues, be it like a language barrier, be it cultural misunderstandings, be it lack of understanding of what it might be like to be a racialized woman going through domestic violence or sexual assault in this country. So oftentimes, either way, there's a situation where they're trapped because the services that are available
aren't accessible.
Need to be much more accessible.
For
Absolutely.
sure. All right. Well, thank you for the conversation. We're just going to take a quick break and then we'll come back. Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is Farheen Khan, and you're watching the AZEEZA show. We have our two guests here, Manal Farouk and Sana Chaudhry, and we're talking about the issue of domestic violence and sexual violence and the need to access service. I know in the previous episodes we've been talking about, what does violence look like? This is about making sure that we have access when we need it. So one of the questions that, sort of even during the break we were talking about was, how do we ensure that why is it important for women to access service, and what are some of the fears that people might have around accessing service, and why, and how can we kind of give people that reassurance that accessing support is important?
Absolutely. I think one of the pieces is that people are afraid that those services aren't necessarily confidential. There's always a fear that somehow the abuser or my family or my community will find out if I access them. Right. But in reality, those services are incredibly confidential. And for example, many service places often say, if we can't reach you by phone, is there an email? If we can't reach you by email, what's the best way we can reach you? There are multiple options in terms of maintaining your confidentiality. So I think that when it comes to accessing those services, 100%, there are so many services available in the GTA for Muslim women in particular, for South Asian women in particular, for racialized women in particular. That and I do believe we'll be talking about that later as well. But there are services available. They are confidential, and it is 100% in the right of any woman to access those things.
Absolutely. I mean, the reason why Sakina Homes was formed in the first place was because there's a lack of culturally and religiously sensitive programming out there and aid out there for people, for Muslim and women and children. So for us, we kind of base all of our, ideologies and our policies around that. And it's very important because, I mean, we were discussing this previously as well, that, the percentage, the risk of fatality goes up much higher when someone decides to leave, or someone confronts their abuser and decides to leave. And it's an average of, I believe, 7 times. I think that's still the average that holds, that someone will leave and return to their abuser before they leave for good, right, or before they're killed. So it's very difficult. We've had it happen at the transitional homes as well, that people have come, they've stayed, they've gone back, and they've come a second time. So it's a process, and I think something that I've seen at some other mainstream shelters is maybe an issue, which is that they say that, once you come to us and you leave, there's a 4-month waiting period and you can't come back in that time.
Depends also how they leave, right?
Absolutely,
like, 'cause if the abuser's the one to pick them up, then that's no
then
longer
there's
a
an
safe
issue.
space,
Absolutely,
right? They can't come back there.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, it's very important for them to know of these services because, again, confidentiality is key in these. So, I think a lot of the fear hinges on the fact that people don't understand that you don't have to give your name. You don't even have to give your telephone number. You can give an email. You don't have to give an email. You can give any kind of way to contact you. If you don't want them to contact you, just say I'll contact you again if I need you. Right? There's a lot of ways to get help. It's out there. You just have to go out there and find it. And obviously, there's people in the community who can always steer you in the right direction as well.
Can you tell me I'm just going to ask this. I mean, why is it, do you think, that women actually go back when they've decided to leave? What is it about? I have my own perspective on that, but what do you, as the experts here, tell us what you think is reason for that?
Oftentimes, like we mentioned before, it's the fact that, especially if you're coming from like an immigrant background or like a racialized background, oftentimes within Canadian society, your community is all you have, or your family unit is all you have. Particularly when there's a situation of abuse, say monetary abuse, legal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. That's all you have, and for example, like accessing your documents, accessing family, being able to have that support is within that unit or within that family or community unit. So oftentimes there are no other options because as we've talked about, the shelter system does have certain flaws in it, particularly when it comes to racialized women and women of faith. So small examples like certain shelters, there have been cases where they've not allowed Muslim women to pray. So oftentimes there's no other option, and that's why spaces like AZEEZA Homes and Sakina is so important because it gives space. But the reality is that there's so many cases that women don't know, and if they do know, they're afraid to go access those services, and oftentimes they go back because that's all they know, right? And they need support, they need monetary support, they need financial housing, they need all those things. And as I'm sure we all know, Toronto City Housing has a wait list for I think 4 years right now.
I think 8 right now.
Yeah,
8 right now? Okay.
8 years,
It used to be 19, I think, and then they finally.
Yeah, so there's so many different factors. So again, I think it comes back to the fact that services across all sectors need to be way more cognizant of the fact that the system doesn't serve women. The system does not serve women who've been through sexual abuse at this moment in time.
But at this point, we're still encouraging people to reach out for support, right?
Definitely.
So to be clear on that, right?
Yeah,
Because I mean,
100%.
certainly not everything is perfect, but I think one of the things also, I mean, if I can say this, is that as women, we try our best to overlook things, try to fix things, right? We never want to give up. There's always that sort of string of hope that he still loves me and I still love him, and if we just remove the element of love, abuse, then he's a perfect person and everything's great, and so there's that constant sort of want to go back, hoping that, right? And so there's that whole sort of, what do you call it, the honeymoon phase that kind of kicks in, right?
Abuse, right? Where it's there's the honeymoon period where everything's great, you're going out for dinners, there's flowers coming at home, you're going on trips, everything's great with you, everything's with the kids. Then there's the frustration period where there's outbursts, and then there is the abuse period where it could be physical abuse, it could be psychological abuse, it could be emotional abuse, it could be sexual abuse. And then there is, the leaving period. If you decide to leave, or if you're separated, and then it starts again. If you give another chance, you kind of connect that cycle to continue again and again. I actually posted something over Ramadan last year, where I was taking a walk around my neighborhood after I don't know how long, and I had headphones on. I was walking down a few blocks away from my house, and I saw a woman sitting on the curb. So long story short, I asked her what was happening. Her husband had abused her. She needed a phone to call her mom and her brother to pick her up. She used my phone. I waited with her. We went to Tim Hortons. I waited with her. They came. She was with her mom. Her brother came to me, thanked me, and then said, you know what? This is her 6th time leaving him in the past 4 years. So I said, what does she say when she goes back to him? He comes to the house, he cries, he says, I'm so sorry, I'm so stressed out at work, and everything was kind of just touching my nerve that day, and it was the last straw, and I'm so sorry, but I'm better. I'm gonna go to therapy, I'm gonna go to counseling, it's gonna be better. And it hardly ever is.
Yeah, for sure.
It hardly ever is. And I think that's one of the reasons why people go back, because they have that hope. Like you said, women are raised to be strong, women are raised to be the backbone of the family, and that's how they picture themselves. They always think about their kids first, if they have kids, how are my kids going to survive without a father? How are they going to be raised? Are they going to be raised well? He's a good father, but he might not be a good husband, right? So there's always that discrepancy there, and that might be another reason why women sometimes tend to stay in abusive marriages or situations, or go back to them after they've left them in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's why, like, you know, one of the things is that when you're, you know, I think part of the other challenges is that we often internalize that perhaps it's our own fault, right? People around us might tell us that as well, like, oh, well, you're not doing, you know, you're not cleaning the house well enough, or you're not cooking well, or there's not enough salt and stuff like this. And one of the things that, you know, personally I've started to realize is that, you know, when we believe these things about ourselves, it's like, you know, today it's one thing, tomorrow it'll be another, right? It's not actually what it is that you're doing wrong. It's actually, you know, just an excuse that's being used, right? To be able to maintain that power over.
I mean, I always say, you know, there's no excuse for abuse at all in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't matter what you're doing.
Right.
You can't ever abuse someone else. That's just the way it goes. You know, do whatever you want in your life, but as soon as it affects someone else negatively, you got to recheck what you're doing, because it's not acceptable no matter what.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think like a part of what we were saying is the fact that there are those structures that, you know, like be their cultural, familial values, whatever, that make it okay to say, oh, it's you.
Right.
It's what you're doing.
Right.
And a part of that is also just, you know, emotional manipulation and, you know, all of that sort of emotional baggage that is often placed upon women, you know, that they have to do the emotional labor, that they have to make the sacrifice. So I think a part of this, again, like comes down to raising men and within community and within families to, you know, take that onus of emotional labor and realize that, you know, they're able to actually stop the cycle of abuse and violence.
For sure. So can we talk a little bit about why accessing counseling is really important? I know, you know, we've heard it many times before. There's this whole sort of stigma around access to supports around mental health. Why is that important?
It is, I think, important for everybody, actually. Even if you're not going through something at this moment, it's always good to have the number of a counselor or even like a helpline or a therapist on hand. I personally use a therapist. It's a great place for me to kind of dump all my feelings, because in this line of work it's very hard to get a good night's sleep. It's, you know, one story after another. I always say out of 365 days you have maybe 12 good days in the sector, like days where you're happy. So, you know, for me, I feel like it's important, but I feel like it's important for everybody to have that, because it's something that's confidential. You can say whatever you want, and, you know, that person's gonna be there to help you through it. They're never gonna tell you what to do. They're gonna be there to listen, to help you through it, to find other access other resources that may help you in other ways. So I think it's so important to have that, and people kind of put a huge stigma around it and say, you know what, you only use a counselor, you only use a therapist if you have severe mental health issues. And if it ever gets out in your family that, oh, you're seeing a therapist or you're seeing a counselor or something like this, it's kind of like, whoa, hang on, like, what's wrong with you? Right? Like, would someone want to get married to you? Like, do you have a severe mental health issue? Like, what's going on? So I think that stigma around it has to be broken, and understand that counselors and therapists are great. You know, you don't have to have a mental health issue to go to them and talk to them. It could be for anything. For me, I started when I started in this line of work, because there's just so much, and obviously I'm bound by confidentiality with my clients, that there's only so much I could even share at home, right? Like, and it kind of just gets to be too much. You need to have that release somewhere. So for me, I think for everybody, they should definitely have a counselor or therapist, or use a helpline at least, because it really helps talking things through.
Exactly, and I think a part of it is that they can actually connect you to resources that you know, would actually allow you, so like health services, further mental health services and whatnot, because end of the day, when, for example, it's a community issue or a family issue, when you go to your family or community to talk about it, oftentimes, you know, the same situation happens where they blame you or they gaslight you, or you know, they aren't supportive or they don't believe you. So by going to a therapist, you're going to someone who is outside of that circle that can actually inform you about what is happening. It can assist with your mental health, and again, like support you in multiple various ways as well.
Okay, that's great. So I think we only have a few minutes left, and I want to thank you both for, you know, being on the show. Do you have any sort of last minute thoughts that you want to share?
Do you want to start us off with any?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is believe survivors. When someone discloses something to you, be there to support them. You know, find services that'll assist them, because when someone's going through something like that, they need people around them to help. So I think the biggest thing is, you know, talk to the men in your family, talk to the men in your community, talk to the women in your community. I think at this moment in time, there's a really wonderful opening that we can have these conversations because these are conversations that we've been needing to have for a long time. So believe survivors and honestly just have conversations that are difficult because it's time.
I think I would just reiterate and echo what Manal said here, because honestly, being there for somebody, and even if you don't have a whole list of resources to give them, work with them through it. And you don't have to have every answer in order to be there for somebody. If someone comes to you, don't say, hey, hang on, I can't listen to you because I don't know, so here's a number. Listen to them, work through it with them. Okay, everyone knows that everyone has limitations. So you know what? Work with them to find resources. With them to help them, get better, and just be there for them and listen. I would say the exact same thing.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for
for
being on the
Thanks for
show.
having us.
Thanks for having this conversation with me and with our viewers. Thank you everyone for watching today. As you've heard, we need to listen to our women. We need to believe them when they say that they're being abused. Sometimes we don't even know that we're going through it. It's important to remember and to think about what does it mean to actually be treated with love, respect, and dignity. And that's something that I think we can all reflect on this time around. So if you do feel that you're in a situation where you're going through a difficult time, definitely reach out to someone, whether it be a family member or a service. It's all confidential, and we're all here for you. Thank you.